We finished Unit 1, which talks about preparing for negotiation and planning your negotiation strategy. And now we're ready to move on to the actual negotiation itself and to look at some key tactics for success during the negotiation. In covering this unit, we're going to focus on three main aspects. First, the importance of getting to know the other side at the beginning of a negotiation. Second, the importance of understanding your power and where your power comes from. And then finally, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time, what negotiation tools, what psychological tools can you use for successful negotiation? And by the same token, what are the psychological traps that the other side might use and that you want to avoid? So let's start with getting to know the other side. Now, this ability or willingness to get to know the other side first is difficult for people from some cultures. It's often difficult for Americans, for example. Americans tend to be very time-oriented. Time is money. When we go into a different culture, often we'll set aside a amount of time for the negotiation. And we want to get right down to business. We want to start talking about the deal immediately rather than spending the time to get to know the other side. However, it's not only Americans. Other cultures have similar traits. For example, a few years ago, I was teaching in an executive program, and one of the participants in the program was a lawyer from Singapore, and she was involved in the free trade negotiations between Singapore and other countries. And she explained to me that she felt Singaporeans were very similar to Americans, very linear, very task-oriented, very focused on moving right to the negotiations. And she gave an example. She said that when she and her team traveled to India to negotiate a free trade agreement, they completely struck out because the Indian style was so different. The Indian team wanted to get to know them as individuals, wanted to find out, are these people we can trust, before diving into the details of the negotiation. So their negotiation with the Indians completely failed. They went back to Singapore. They underwent cross-cultural negotiation training conducted by the former ambassador from Singapore to India, and then they returned and were successful. So it's not only the United States, it's other cultures as well that sometimes have difficulty with this notion of getting to know the other side. I had a little bit of personal experience with this. I was Associate Dean of the Michigan Business School and in charge of executive education. And I wanted to set up an executive center for Michigan in Paris. I learned that a new business school was being built near the Grand Arch in Paris, out in the La Défense area. And I very much wanted the new business school to give me a floor or a half a floor in their building to conduct executive education. And I knew this would be very expensive because this is an expensive part of Paris. Paris is an expensive city. So I was looking forward to some very difficult negotiations. So I flew over to Paris with 2 faculty members. And when we arrived, the president of the new university and the dean of the business school invited us out for dinner. And we went to a quaint little restaurant on the left bank, and we spent an evening in the restaurant talking not about the lease negotiations, but about other things. And as it turned out, the president of the university had done his doctoral dissertation on an obscure English poet and mystic by the name of William Blake. As it also turned out, one of the faculty members with me was a William Blake fanatic. He loved William Blake. And so they spent the entire evening rhapsodizing about how great William Blake is. The following morning, we walked into the negotiating room. We had a half day scheduled for the negotiation. The other school basically gave us the space we wanted. We didn't have to pay any rent. We had to pay a percentage of profits, which we knew we were going to have to do anyway, but we got a very good deal, and I think I owe that all to William Blake, even though that evening I was awfully tired of learning about William Blake, but it resulted in a very successful negotiation. So basic message here is try to spend time getting to know the other side. Very important in some cultures. In some cultures, there's less reliance on a formal legal contract as we rely on in the West. There's much more importance on trying to evaluate the quality of the other side, whether you're dealing with somebody you can trust, and often this occurs through the process of getting to know the other side. Even something as simple as a handshake at the beginning of a negotiation can have a positive impact. There was some recent research conducted by professors at Harvard and Chicago, which concluded that when people started the negotiation with a handshake, at least in the West, maybe not in all countries, that the results of the negotiation were more positive and that there was more cooperation between the two sides. This is one final consideration when you're getting to know the other side at the beginning of a negotiation, and that is try to develop your conversational intelligence. This is some advice from an article in the Wall Street Journal. It's not hardcore research, it's common sense, but yet it's common sense that many of us forget, including myself. And that is advice such as when you're meeting somebody, either socially or in business, try to avoid your favorite topic. You'll end up talking too much. Ask a lot of questions. People love to talk about themselves, and they'll think you're a great conversationalist if you talk about them. And finally, listening is critical. We're going to be talking more about listening, but here you have some cues from Mr. Ninan. Say things such as, so you think that, so what you're saying is, a conversation can go on indefinitely, as he points out. So again, just some common sense tips on getting to know, on conversation and intelligence when you're getting to know somebody at the beginning of a negotiation, or if you're in any social setting. In this unit, we're talking about tactics to use during the actual negotiation. And one very important tactic, one very important aspect of the negotiation is to understand your power. And let me start by asking you this question. What is your source of power in a negotiation? In any negotiation, where does your power come from? Please think about that for a second. Maybe jot down your answer. I think people generally agree that information represents your main source of power in a negotiation. And how do you get that information during the actual negotiation process? You ask a lot of questions. Some people, especially traditionalists, think of negotiation as a persuasion. You're trying to persuade somebody else to do what you want. When in fact, the best negotiators are the ones who, while they might be persuasive, are the ones who ask questions, harvest information, and then use that information to analyze your position and to analyze your interests. A friend of mine who used to conduct negotiation seminars with me used to explain to the class that not only should you ask questions, but it's very important to listen carefully to the answers and analyze the answers. That's why God gave us, in his view, 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we could spend more time listening than speaking. There's a cross-cultural element to the ability to ask questions and to listen carefully to the answers. For example, there have been some studies of German negotiators and Chinese negotiators, and the conclusion was that Chinese negotiators ask 3 times as many questions as German negotiators. And that means the Chinese negotiators are harvesting that much more information to use in the negotiation. The ability to ask questions and the ability to listen are important for more than just negotiation purposes. I worked for several years with a large international consulting firm. And one day I was having lunch with one of the leaders of the firm, somebody who's worked with leaders around the world. And I asked him, why is it that some people move to the top of an organization while other people become stranded at a middle level? Even though both people are very talented, both people are smart, articulate, but I explained to him that I've seen this often with my students. 2 students graduate from Michigan, and one moves to the top, and the other remains more in a middle level position. And he didn't hesitate in giving me an answer. He said, really, it boils down to 2 factors. Number 1 is conceptual knowledge that comes from your experience in the business, understanding the business, building on your experience. And number 2, he said, is the importance of the ability to listen, the ability to hear. He asked me if we had any courses on listening in business schools, and I explained to him that no, not to my knowledge. Probably professors are the very worst people to teach courses on listening, but yet it's a very important tool in negotiation and for anyone who wants to move to a leadership position. Now, I do have some bad news for many of you who are participating in this course. And that is that many of you physically are unable to listen as well as other people. There have been some recent studies based on brain scans, so-called fMRIs, that indicate that males are able to listen with only half their brain. Now, this is something probably females could have told us a long time ago without the brain scans, but if you are male, then you have to work extra hard to develop your listening ability. So your power generally comes from information, and this information comes from asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. But there's a more specific aspect of power. There's a particular piece of information that is especially important in negotiation. We've already covered this piece of information in another context, but can you guess what that information is? If you could ask for one specific piece of information, what might that be in a negotiation? Think about that for a second and write down your answer. The specific piece of information that's especially valuable in a negotiation is information about the other side's BATNA. And the reason for that is that your BATNA gives you power and the other side's BATNA gives them power. The BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, gives you leverage so that if your BATNA is strong, then you can negotiate much more from a much more powerful position. You have a lot greater strength because you have a great alternative. And so given the fact that your BATNA gives you power, one of the first things you want to do in a negotiation is to find out how powerful the other side is by trying to discover what their BATNA is. What is their alternative? And they're going to do the same thing to you. They're going to try to find out what your BATNA is. Question: will you tell the other side what your BATNA is? Think about that for a second and write down yes or no. Yes, I will disclose my BATNA. No, I will try to keep my BATNA secret. The best answer, in my opinion, is that it depends. If you have a weak BATNA, if your alternatives are weak, if you're negotiating from a position of weakness, then you definitely do not want the other side to know what your BATNA is. However, if your BATNA is strong, then you absolutely want them to know what your BATNA is, because they know that it will be easy for you to walk away and to pursue the alternative. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is close to Detroit, Michigan, where the major auto companies are based. And when a major auto company like Ford is negotiating with a supplier, I'm guessing they'll tell the supplier their BATNA before they even say good morning. They'll probably say to the supplier, look, we want you to cut your costs even further in this round of contract negotiations. And if you don't, I've got 5 other suppliers sitting in the waiting room who would be delighted to have our business. They'll let you know their BATNA up front. So whether you disclose or not depends on the strength of your BATNA. Once you find out their BATNA, then your next strategy in a negotiation is to try to weaken their power, try to weaken their alternative, weaken their BATNA. So for example, let's say you're a supplier negotiating with Ford, and they tell you that they have 5 other suppliers waiting in the waiting room. Well, what can you do in that situation? How can you weaken their view of their BATNA? Think about that for a second. You might even press pause and write down your answer. If I were a supplier, I would try to point out to Ford that, look, I've been supplying you for years. I've been very reliable with delivery. The quality has been high. I've partnered with you in developing new products, new components. You know you can count on me. Yes, my price might be a little bit higher, but you're getting much higher quality. Whereas if you take a chance with one of those other suppliers, then you might not get delivery on time. You might not get the same quality product. They're not going to be willing to work with you on new product development the way we are, and so on. That would be my pitch, to try to weaken their power, to weaken their BATNA. And the third and final piece of your BATNA strategy is to try to improve your power, improve your alternatives. This is something you'll actually probably do before the negotiation begins. You'll try to develop alternatives and use that as a source of strength. For example, you see quotes like this in the business press. Millennium Pharmaceuticals. Whenever we feel there's a possibility of a deal with someone, we immediately call 6 other people. It drives you nuts trying to juggle them all, but it will change the perception of the other side. Or this quote from AOL, you would never do a deal without talking to anyone else. Never. Now what they're saying in negotiation language is, we want to strengthen our BATNA by talking with other parties. We always talk with other parties. We always develop alternatives to strengthen our position. So that basically represents your BATNA strategy during a negotiation. Find out the other side's BATNA, weaken their BATNA, and strengthen your own BATNA. There's one other aspect of power that I'd like to mention, and that is, in some situations, you can develop a coalition as an alternative to the BATNA strategy. And here's an example involving a friend of mine, although I've, of course, changed the names and changed the facts, but this is the basic scenario. My friend was involved in discussion with a couple of other entrepreneurs about forming a tennis center. One of the possible partners in the tennis center was a very well-known retired professional tennis player. The second was less well-known, but known in the local community and sponsored a youth tennis program. The third possible partner, my friend, was not known at all but loves tennis and did some coaching. Now, in their discussions, they realized that the annual profits from this venture were estimated at around $1 million, and about 50% of those profits would result from Ash's involvement. He's the well-known retired pro. 30% would result from Billy's involvement, he's known locally, and 20% from Chris's involvement. So when my friend contacted me, they were negotiating over how the profits should be split. And let's assume that they need at least 2 of the 3 partners in order to form the business. Well, this is a classic coalition bargaining scenario where the traditional BATNA analysis doesn't work because the alternatives are too dynamic. You have too many combinations. There are a lot of different combinations of the 3 parties or 2 of the 3, Ash and Billy, Billy and Chris, Chris and Ash. And in those combinations, you have almost an infinite amount of profit sharing. So for example, Ash obviously is the most powerful party involved here. Ash and Billy might decide to form a separate partnership without Chris, which would give them 80% of the profits. But maybe Ash is very greedy and wants 80% of those profits. And so Chris could then enter the scene and say, hey, Billy, why don't you join with me? Our total profits will be less, but I'll give you a larger share of the profits than what Ash could. And so in a negotiation like this, you can go round and round. There's no mathematically precise solution. It's almost impossible to calculate a BATNA. So what becomes important in a coalition bargaining is developing trust from the other parties, treating the other parties fairly. And when I do this simulation based on this scenario in class, I often find that Billy and Chris might form a coalition and squeeze out Ash because Ash became too greedy and wanted too large a share of the profits. So in other words, forming a coalition is another very powerful form of negotiation, even when on the surface it looks like you are less powerful than the other side. It looks here that Billy and Chris are less powerful than Chris, but by forming a coalition, they might actually squeeze Ash out of the deal. So that concludes our look at the use of power in negotiation. In this unit on negotiation, we've looked at the importance of getting to know the other side at the beginning of the negotiation. We've also discussed various concepts of power, and especially the role that the BATNA plays in establishing your leverage in a negotiation. We're now ready to look at some psychological tools that you can use during a negotiation, but these are also traps that, when used by other parties, you want to avoid. In thinking about these tools and traps, we're going to be looking at some research by people who focus on decision making. And these people fall within 2 camps. Some of the researchers are prescriptive. They try to prescribe how we as human beings should make decisions. The other camp focuses more on descriptive research or behavioral research. They try to look at how we act as human beings, and then they build on that knowledge in providing advice for negotiators. We've already looked at an example of prescriptive, or sometimes called normative, decision making, and that's the use of decision trees. We looked, for example, at how you can use a decision tree in evaluating a decision as to whether to acquire company A or company B. So our focus is going to be on descriptive decision making or behavioral decision making. Now, researchers in this area have discovered that you and I as human beings use certain rules of thumb to simplify our decisions. These rules of thumb are called heuristics. Let me give you an example. This is from a great book by Max Bazerman called Judgment in Managerial Decision Making, which I cited at the bottom. So here's the example. Let's assume that your company has decided to hire an MBA graduate to work in finance at your company. Your company has also decided that it is only going to recruit at the top 10 business schools. So that's your heuristic, that's your rule of thumb that you'll use in making this decision. If you had to criticize the use of that heuristic, what would your criticism be? You might want to hit pause and think about that for a second. What's wrong with recruiting only at the top 10 schools? Your answer might be, you could come up with a variety of reasons, but you might point out that by recruiting only at the top 10 schools, you might miss the very best candidate for your position. There are a number of very talented people who don't attend top 10 schools for a variety of reasons, and some of them might have experiences that would be a perfect fit for your company. So that's a problem with the heuristic. Now let me ask you, if you wanted to defend the heuristic, how might you defend it? Think about that for a second. Again, you might want to hit pause. In defending the heuristic, you might think of factors such as the cost of recruiting, the cost of visiting more than 10 campuses. You also might think of the quality of the candidates. As a general rule, the schools have already pre-screened the candidates for you, and generally the more talented people are going to be at the better schools. So all of us go through this kind of internal cost-benefit analysis in using heuristics, which help us navigate through a very complicated and uncertain world. And there's some good news and bad news with our use of heuristics. The good news is that these heuristics are mostly helpful in making decisions. The bad news is that occasionally they can result in serious error. And this is where we're going to focus. Where does our use of heuristics result in serious error that can cause problems during negotiation? It can cause you to fall into traps, or these errors can be beneficial when you're using them as a tool during your negotiations. So what we're going to do is to look deep into the human mind and try to determine how these errors can be used as tools to use or traps to avoid. Now, before we dive into these heuristics, let me ask you a trivia question. And the question is, who is probably the most successful investor in the world? And that answer is Warren Buffett. Now let me ask you a tougher trivia question. Over the years, when Buffett has faced serious financial decisions, there's always one person he goes to for advice. And who is that person? Tougher question. The answer to that is a man by the name of Charlie Munger. Mr. Munger attended the University of Michigan. He never graduated. He then talked his way into Harvard Law School. And after law school, he started a very successful law firm in Los Angeles. Over the last couple of years, it's been named the top law firm in the country. However, fairly early on, he decided that he wanted to focus on investments, and so he became Buffett's partner. Now, he hasn't been quite as successful as Buffett. He's only worth about $1 billion, but still he has been very successful. And somebody told me once that whenever Munger faces a difficult financial decision, he pulls a checklist out of his pocket. and he goes through the list to make sure that he doesn't fall into any trap. I'm not sure that the story is true or not, but somebody relayed that to me. So when we're done with this session, you're going to have your own checklist that you can use. And this checklist of psychological tools and traps will be useful not only in negotiation, but also in financial decision-making, in leadership decision-making. So this session, I think, is possibly the most important in the whole course. As we go through the various tools and traps, I'm going to use actual experiments that were used by the decision researchers in coming up with these tools. So you'll have a chance to experience why and how these tools work. So let's start with something called the mythical fixed pie assumption. This is an assumption you and I make during a negotiation. We automatically assume that our interests are in direct conflict with the interests of the other side. Let's try a quick experiment. Let's assume that you are going to arm wrestle with someone else. And if you're in a room with somebody else, please try this. Otherwise, just think about what the results might be. So what I'm going to do is to ask you to arm wrestle for 10 seconds. And you will receive a point for every time you can push the other person's hand to the table. And I want you to try to score as many points as possible within 10 seconds. So if you're in a room with somebody, press pause and try this for 10 seconds, 10-second limit. And if you're not in a room, just think about this for a second. What do you think the score will be? When I do an exercise like this in class, what I discover is that for most of the students in the class, assuming they're paired up with somebody who's fairly equal physically, the scores tend to be 3-2 or 4-4 in that range. That's for most of the class. But for some of the students in the class, the scores turn out to be 20-20, 25-25, 30-30. So what's going on? How do you explain the difference between the scores? The difference is that most of the students in the class fell into the mythical fixed pie assumption trap. They assumed that this was a competition, and they tried to beat the other side. Did I say try to score more points than the other side? No. I said try to score as many points as possible. The people who scored the most points, and in fact built a larger pie, realized it was not a competition and that there was no conflict in interest, and so they would simply go back and forth and score a lot of points. So that's a physical illustration of this mythical fixed pie assumption that we all face in negotiation. Now, one piece of psychology that's related to the mythical fixed pie assumption is something called reactive devaluation. And these words mean pretty much what they say. During a negotiation, because we think of the other side as a competitor, we tend to react to their proposals by devaluing them. So, for instance, a few years ago, several years ago, a researcher did a study that went something like this. It was during the Cold War era, and this researcher took an arms reduction proposal to a group of subjects and said, this is an arms reduction proposal from President Gorbachev of Russia. What do you think of it? And these subjects, who were all Americans, basically said, that's a bad proposal. Then the researcher took the same proposal to another group of American subjects and said, this is an arms reduction proposal from President Reagan. What do you think of it? Oh, this is a very good proposal. Same proposal, but they reacted to it differently because one group devalued it, thinking it came from Russia. the other group accepted it as it was. So very important to keep in mind this tendency toward reactive devaluation. When you fall into this trap, you lose the opportunity to consider what might be a great proposal that would satisfy your interests. I see this especially when I do exercises involving dispute resolution. I do one exercise, for instance, where the students represent a plaintiff who has sued a licensee, and the licensee comes in with a pretty good settlement offer. And what's the reaction of the students who are playing the role of the plaintiff? Often they will not even consider that proposal. They think, well, this person must be making the proposal because of weakness in their case. They react to it by devaluing it because they consider the other side a competitor. Our next psychological tool relates to a concept called anchoring, which basically means that you and I anchor on an initial value when estimating the value of uncertain objects. Let's try an experiment. Please get your pencil and paper ready. Now, here's the experiment. Think of the last 3 digits of your phone number, add 400 to them, pull out a calculator if you need one, and write down the total. So you should have a number that's the last 3 digits of your phone number plus 400. Attila the Hun was one of the most feared conquerors in world history. He was eventually defeated, AD, and my question to you is, was he defeated before or after the number you wrote down? Assuming that number is an AD year, was he defeated before or after that number? So write down the word before or after. So you should have 2 things written down, last 3 digits plus 400, and the word before or the word after. And then finally, write down the year, again during the Common Era, in which Attila the Hun was defeated. No fair Googling to get the answer. Okay, when I do this in class, this experiment in class, I end up often with results that look like this. So on the left, you have ranges for the last 3 digits of the phone number plus 400. And on the right, you have an average date of defeat of Attila the Hun. Now, if you were a scientist looking at that data, sitting back and looking at that data, what does that data tell you? As you can see, as the phone numbers plus 400 increase, the dates of defeat of Attila the Hun also increase. In other words, the phone number influences the date that you chose for the defeat of Attila the Hun. By the way, the date of defeat was 451. See if you got it right. So this is what anchoring is all about. You can pick a completely random number. What does your phone number have to do with when Attila the Hun was defeated? Nothing. But yet we anchor, we latch on to that, to a number that's thrown out when we're trying to deal with an uncertain question, such as the date of defeat of Attila the Hun. And it's not just ordinary people who fall into this trap or tool. Specialists do as well. For example, you've got an experiment done with 2 sets of surgeons who specialize in lung disease. And so the researcher developed the symptoms of somebody who might have lung disease and went to one group of lung doctors and basically asked them, are the chances of this person having lung disease higher or lower than, and then the researcher picked a random probability, let's say higher or lower than 20%. And the doctors wrote down either higher or lower. And then the researcher asked the doctors to write down what do you think the chances are of this person having lung disease. Okay. Then the researcher went to the second group of lung doctors, same symptoms, and asked them, do you think the person having lung disease, the chances of the person having lung disease are higher or lower, and then selected another random probability. And do you think the chances are higher or lower than this probability? They wrote higher or lower, and what do you think the chances are? Okay, well, guess what happened? The two separate groups of lung doctors anchored on that random probability. Let's say the first random probability was 25% that the researcher threw out. The answers were close to 25% when they had to predict the chance of the person having lung disease. With the second group, let's say the random probability was 50%. Then the probability that they selected clustered around 50%. So even with specialists, such as these physicians, the anchoring trap is common. Now, how does this relate to negotiation? Well, one of the most important questions that you face in any negotiation is who throws out the first price? Think about that for a second. I don't know if you have business experience, but what's the conventional wisdom? Or what does your intuition tell you? If you're negotiating with me, do you want me to throw out the first price, or do you want to throw out the first price? Conventional wisdom says, always let the other side throw out the first price. What does anchoring say? Well, as you might guess, anchoring says you should throw out the first price and try to anchor the other side to your number. If you're the seller, you're going to throw out a high price. You want to anchor the other side to that high price. So we have a conflict. And who's right? Well, I think both sides are right. I think that you should follow the conventional wisdom when you are dealing with the sale of something where the value is very uncertain. Because if the other side throws out the first price, that's one way to obtain information about what the value actually is. But on the other hand, if you're selling something where you're fairly confident of the value, then you should throw out the first price and try to anchor the other side to your either high price or low price. The problem is, and my students often ask me about this dilemma, the problem is, what if both sides are pretty savvy and neither side wants to throw out the first price? You know, your first price choices are it's either you or the other side. Then what do you do when there's a stalemate? Well, you can try something in case of a stalemate that I'm calling an information exchange, which is basically neither side makes an offer or a counteroffer, but instead you try to bring in facts that might be relevant to the value of the thing being sold. This is a strategy that's commonly used by attorneys when they are negotiating the settlement of litigation. There was a study done a number of years ago, and this was the conclusion from the study. In negotiations between lawyers, these negotiations might be less a series of offers and counteroffers and more a process of exchange of information. And so by exchanging information, in this case, by talking about the value of other similar cases, neither side is throwing out an offer, but eventually they're able to reach consensus. And so if you do reach the stalemate situation where neither side is willing to throw out the first offer, I suggest an information exchange. And so that concludes our look at anchoring. Our next psychological tool relates to a concept called overconfidence. And a simple statement of overconfidence is that you and I are overconfident that our judgments are correct. Let me give you an overconfidence test. And this is the nature of the test. I'm going to give you 10 questions. Here's an example, the first question, the year in which Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born. And I want you to pick a range from X year to Y year so that you're 90% confident that the correct answer falls within the range. Now, why do I say 90%? Well, if I said 100%, that would be too easy, because then with every problem, you could say from 0 to a billion and probably answer every question correctly. And so I want you to be 90% confident. That's going to force you to be a little more precise with your answers. So to be successful with this 10-part quiz, you will answer 9 out of the 10 questions correctly. So get your pencil and paper ready, and you can start with this first question. What's a range of years so that you're 90% confident that Mozart's year of birth falls within that range? Okay. Question 2, the length of the Nile River. The length of the Nile River. Again, write down a range so you're 90% confident that the correct answer falls within the range. You can use miles or kilometers. Question 3, the number of times lightning strikes the earth every minute. A range so you're 90% confident the correct answer falls within the range. The time it takes sunlight to reach the earth in seconds. The time it takes sunlight to reach the earth in seconds. The diameter of the moon. And here again, feel free to use miles or kilometers. And by that I mean a full moon. Okay, the number of knives, forks, and spoons in the White House. The number of actively spoken languages in the world. Again, not the specific number, but the range. Actively spoken languages in the world. The gestation period, that is the length of pregnancy, in days of an Asian elephant. The number of conceptions, the number of pregnancies that take place every day over the world. And finally, the length of time a snail can sleep if it is not disturbed in days. If you don't have snails in your country, you may have seen pictures of them. They're little wormy-like creatures that carry their shell on their back. So how long can they sleep in days if not disturbed? Okay, so let's see how you did. Remember, to successfully complete this exercise, you will have answered 9 out of 10 of the questions correctly. Okay, so Mozart was born in 1756. The Nile River, 4,187 miles or 6,738 kilometers. The number of times lightning strikes the earth per minute, 6,000. It takes sunlight 492 seconds, or 8 minutes, 12 seconds, to reach the earth. The diameter of the moon is 2,160 miles. There are 13,092 knives, forks, and spoons in the White House. 6,000 actively spoken languages in the world. The gestation period, the length of pregnancy of an Asian elephant, is 645 days. The number of pregnancies, that's human pregnancies, not Asian elephant pregnancies, that occur daily throughout the world is 365,000. And a snail can sleep, if it is not disturbed, 1,095 days. So, again, you were successful if you answered 9 out of 10 correctly, when I do this in class, it's very rare for anyone to answer 9 out of 10 of these questions correctly. And that's because most of us are overconfident. That's the bad news. Most of us are overconfident. We choose ranges that are too narrow when we're faced with uncertainty, such as these questions. The good news is that virtually the only people who are not overconfident are clinically depressed. Now, overconfidence is something that is studied in a variety of disciplines. Finance professors in business schools love to study overconfidence because they relate it to trading in the stock market. And I think their basic conclusion is that because of overconfidence, people trade too much, and because of the overtrading and transaction costs, they basically lose more money than they should. Accounting professors love to study overconfidence. They look at, for instance, earnings projections by managers, and managers who are successful in making short-term earnings projections are often bad at making long-term projections because of the overconfidence that developed. And it relates to negotiation. I see this in the negotiations conducted by my students, where when they do the negotiation analysis and they try to predict what the ZOPA is, the zone of potential agreement, too often they predict zones that are too narrow, which then limits their ability to reach an agreement and be creative in coming up with a solution that satisfies both sides. So overconfidence pops up in a lot of different venues. Occasionally, especially when I'm teaching executives, I get this question. Well, isn't overconfidence really a good thing? Isn't it a good thing for a manager to be supremely confident so that he or she can persuade the staff to do more than they ever thought was possible? For instance, you see this kind of a statement in various readings. This happens to relate to entrepreneurs. Overconfidence by entrepreneurs may provide the vision necessary to convince potential hires and investors of the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a growing startup. Optimism also leads founders to see the best in people and thus contribute to their social skills. So what's right? Is overconfidence a psychological problem, or is it something that's positive? Well, I think that it's both, but I think you also need to put it into context. When you're talking about decision making, that's when overconfidence is a problem. That's when you want to be a realist. That's when you want to search for disconfirming evidence. However, once you've made the decision and you're implementing the decision, then you can put on your optimist hat and try to persuade people to do more than they thought possible. The challenge in decision making is it especially relates to searching for disconfirming evidence that challenges your thinking. We all fall into the trap of trying to find confirming evidence. So let me try this experiment with you. I'm thinking of 3 numbers, 2, 4, and 6. This is a sequence of numbers, and I have a rule in my head that I used in developing this sequence. And I want you to try to guess what rule is in my head. So think about this for a second. And if you were in class, I would allow you to add 3 numbers to this to test your theory. So you could add 3 numbers to my sequence. Now what happens in class when students volunteer is that, let's say a student thinks that my rule is the numbers increase by 2. So the students will add 3 numbers. They'll say 2, 4, 6, okay, 8, 10, 12. And then I'll tell them that's not my rule. Other students might say, well, you're adding the prior 2 numbers. So 2 plus 4 is 6, 6 plus 4 is 10 would be the next number, 10 plus 6 is 16 would be the next number. 16 plus 10 would be 26 would be the next number. So they give me those numbers because they think that's the rule. And I say, no, that's not my rule. Now my rule is actually very simple. My rule is simply the numbers increase in value. But notice what the students do. When they come up with an idea of what they think is the rule, do they test it with evidence that confirms their rule or disconfirms their rule? They select evidence that confirms their rule. So the person who thought the numbers increase by 2 selected as the test 8, 10, and 12. And I said, well, yes, that meets my rule, but it does meet my rule, but then they make the wrong guess as to what the rule is when they think it increases by 2. What they should do is to select disconfirming evidence. That student should have selected, for example, 7, 8, and 9, where the numbers did not increase by 2, but still met my rule. If they had done that, then they would know that their guess was wrong. So it's very difficult for the human mind to focus on disconfirming evidence. We automatically gravitate toward confirming evidence, but yet I think we need more studies on this, but I think many great leaders are the ones who are surrounded by people who challenge their thinking and test their thinking rather than people who simply agree with whatever the leader proposes. So that concludes our look at overconfidence. Our next psychological tool or trap is framing. Framing relates to the way that options are framed. The way they are framed causes us to be either risk-averse, if there's a positive frame, or risk-seeking, if a negative frame. So let's try this experiment. And here's the deal. If you are sitting in a country outside the United States, I've got a special bonus for you, a special gift in appreciation for your participation in the course. Let me make it clear, this is a hypothetical. So in accepting this gift, you have to make a choice. Your gift will be either $250, which I'll send you in an envelope, or I'll send you another envelope, if you pick the other option, where 3 out of 4 of the envelopes will be empty, and 1 out of 4 will contain a $1,000 gift. So I want you to think about which of those options you'll select. If you select the option on the right, you definitely will receive in the mail an envelope containing $250. If you select the option on the left, 3/4 of you will receive an empty envelope. The other 1/4 will receive an envelope containing $1,000. So do you have your decision in mind? When I ask my class this question, probably 80 to 90% of the class select the $250 gift. Okay? Now, I've got another choice, and this choice is going to be for the people from the United States. Let's assume that I had to think of a way to pay for this gift. And so I've decided to charge you for taking this course, and you've got 2 choices in paying for the course. If you pick the option on the right, you are going to receive a bill for $250, which you have to pay for the course. And it's already too late to drop out. If you select the option on the left, you'll receive an envelope, and 3/4 of you will have the bill paid. You'll owe nothing. 1/4 of you will pay $1,000. So you have to pick one of these 2 options. Which option will it be? Will you pick the option where you're going to get the $250 bill, which you must pay, or the option where 3 out of 4 of you will receive the course for free, and 1 out of 4 will receive a bill for $1,000? select either the right option or the left option. When I do this one in class, the overwhelming majority pick the left side and decide to take a chance. Okay, so when you look at the two options side by side, what's the basic difference? Well, the option on the top is a positive choice, and the option on the bottom is a negative choice. And what the researchers have discovered is that when you and I are faced with a positive choice, we tend to be risk averse, in this case, going for the sure thing. When we're faced with a negative choice, we tend to be risk seeking, in this case, opting for the choice on the left. This relates to work done by a famous psychologist named Danny Kahneman, who was the only psychologist to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics. It's based on a theory called prospect theory. So let's try to apply this to a more realistic scenario. And here is the scenario. You're the director of a clinic. You're preparing for the outbreak of a disease, and this disease you think is going to kill 600 people in your area. You have two key staff members who are negotiating and arguing, disagreeing over which of the following two options you should choose. Which one would you choose? With Program A, you know that you will save 200 of the 600 people. There's no question you're going to save 200 of the 600. With Program B, there's a 1/3 chance you'll save all 600, but a 2/3 chance that you'll save nobody. So please make your selection, Program A or Program B. Okay, now let me give you two other options and see what you would decide. Instead of Program A and Program B, let's assume that these are your choices. You have to choose between Program C, where 400 people are going to die, and Program D, where there's a 1/3 chance nobody will die, and a 2/3 chance 600 will die. So now make your decision as the director of the clinic, Program C or Program D. This is based on a study by Kahneman and Tversky, and the results were that when people are faced with a choice between Program A and Program B, 3/4 of them pick Program A. And when people are faced with a choice between Program C and Program D, almost 90% pick Program D. But what's the difference between Program A and Program C? They're identical. It's just the way that the choice is framed. What's the difference between B and D? They're identical. The only difference is the way that the choice is framed. So this is a powerful illustration that the way you frame a choice as a positive choice, as between Program A and Program B, or a negative choice, as in the choice between C and D, can have a huge influence on the decision. With a positive choice between A and B, people become risk averse. They choose the sure thing, Program A. With Program C and D framed as a negative choice, then people pick the risk averse option, Program D, even though it's the same as Program B. So this is a very powerful tool for your negotiating kit. And that concludes our look at framing. Our next psychological tool is called availability. And what that means is that you and I are influenced by information that is most easily available. So let's try another experiment, a question that I have for you. Here's the question. Are there more deaths each year in the United States from motor vehicle accidents or from lung cancer? Please make your choice. When I asked this question in class, a fairly large percentage of students, around 80%, select motor vehicle accidents. Here's the actual data, the most recent data. In the most recent year, there were 34,000 deaths relating to motor vehicle accidents and 160,000 deaths related to cancer. So what's happening here? Why do most people select motor vehicle accidents? I teach negotiation every year, by the way, in a large metropolitan hospital to doctors who are taking leadership positions in the hospital. And I always expect the doctors to get this one correctly. And their scores are probably worse than anyone. About 95% of the doctors select motor vehicle accidents. So what's going on here? Why do you think that you selected motor vehicle accidents? My guess is, and this probably happened in just a split second, it happened so fast that you didn't realize it was happening. You retrieved information that led you to select motor vehicle accidents. And this information might be what you see in the nightly news when you see the wreckage from a car accident. It might be something you see in the newspaper. It might be something you see when you're surfing the net. You see the results, often gory results from motor vehicle accidents. Whereas when somebody dies from lung cancer, it's not newsworthy. It's not front page news. It might not even be mentioned in the person's obituary. So you were able to easily retrieve the information about motor vehicle accidents which biased your decision despite the dramatic evidence to the contrary. So availability is something that is useful in a variety of fronts. For instance, it's been used over the years by very successful investors. There was an investor by the name of Peter Lynch who ran a huge mutual fund called Magellan. And this was one of his key guides in making investment decisions. He did not want to be trapped by the availability concept. He wanted to avoid relying too much on information that was easily available. And he searched more for companies that were a little bit more bland and boring. It's something that can also be used in negotiation. For instance, several years ago, I was working with somebody from the aerospace industry. And he explained to me that his company was involved in negotiations with the government. They wanted to sell the government fighter planes. And of course, there were competitors who also wanted this business. This was big business, hundreds of millions of dollars. So as part of the negotiations, his company wanted to prepare videos showing what the fighter planes would look like in action. And he said they had two choices. One was a video showing the fighter plane flying above the clouds on a beautiful sunny day with light classical music playing in the background. The other was a video showing the fighter plane on a dark, stormy day, thunderstorm, lightning, loud hard rock music playing. And he wondered which of these two videos should be shown to the government. My thought, I'm not sure if you'll agree with this or not, but my thought is go with the second video. Because the second video is the one that's going to be more memorable in the minds of the government decision makers when they make their decisions several months later. That one is more like the automobile accident. It's more dramatic, more memorable than the fighter plane flying above the clouds on a light sunny day. So that's the principle of availability. Our next psychological tool, or trap, relates to a concept called escalation. And the basic takeaway from this concept is that the most successful negotiators are able to look at the negotiations from the perspective of the other side. However, there is also another very important lesson from escalation that I want to mention. In teaching escalation, I use an exercise in class called the dollar auction, where basically I hold up a $20 bill, the meaning of life, and I explain to the class that I'm going to auction off the $20 bill to the highest bidder. They can bid in increments of $1. The highest bidder gets the 20. So if the highest bidder bids 12, that person pays me 12 and I give them the $20 bill. The only catch is that the second highest bidder also has to pay me. So if the second highest bidder bids 10, that person pays me 10 and receives nothing from me. So when I do this in class, what I've discovered is that at the beginning of the dollar auction, a lot of people participate. And then gradually, as you approach $20, most of them drop out. And so you're left with two bidders. Let's say, for instance, bidder A has bid 18, then bidder B comes in with 19. Now, if it stops right there, bidder B pays me 19 and receives the 20. Bidder A pays me 18 and gets nothing. So bidder A quickly figures out, well, if I jump to $20, then I'm going to pay 20, get 20 back, and I'll break even. So they bid 20. Then bidder B realizes, well, rather than paying 19 and get nothing back, I'll bid 21 and get 20 back, so I'm only out $1. So often the bidding will continue beyond 20 and move up into $30 or even $40 until finally the parties realized that this could go on indefinitely. And it did, not in my class, but in a class taught by a prominent professor at another university. And he explained that he did the dollar auction in his executive MBA class, and he explained very clearly to the students in the class that this wasn't just a game. They had to pay whatever they bid. So take the wildest guess possible as to what the winning bid was. The winning bid in his class, the person who won the $20, bid $15,000. The person who came in second bid $14,500. Now, of course, as the numbers got larger, he wasn't limited to $1 increases. He allowed $500 increases. And these two people had to write him a check for the $15,000 who got the $20 and the $14,500 person who didn't get anything. So he was very curious when this was over. What was going on? Why in the world would they bid so much money? Well, he asked the winning bidder, and she explained that she was a doctor. She liked to make donations to charity. She sort of guessed he was not going to keep the money. He was going to give it to charity. And so she decided to have fun with it and also make a charitable contribution with the $15,000. Then he asked the $14,500 person, why in the world would you bid that much? And this person explained that he just got caught up in the competition. He was a very competitive person. As I recall, he was an entrepreneur, and he just hated to lose. And so as a result, he was out $14,500 and did not even get the $20 back. Now, a lesson from this is something called competitive arousal that was written up in the Harvard Business Review. Competitive arousal occurs in a scenario like this, where there's intense rivalry, in this case a one-on-one competition, there's a lot of time pressure, and you're in the spotlight. In this case, they're bidding in front of the class. And so when you're in this situation, this article advises that you try to limit the role of someone who is especially intense, if you're involved in negotiations, for instance. Try to manage time better, and try to spread responsibility so one person is not in the spotlight. If you're interested in this, you can look at this Harvard Business Review article called When Winning is Everything. Here's an example written up in the Times of India. Sunil Mittal, very successful entrepreneur. He desperately wanted to acquire MTN, and according to this article, he was in a state of competitive arousal. When a CEO is in this state, he's more prone to make the sort of rash decisions he would not make otherwise. And so this is one lesson from the concept of escalation, that you want to avoid becoming so competitive that your decisions do not make sense. But there's another very important lesson from this, and that is always try to look at every deal, every negotiation, in this case, the auction scenario, from the perspective of the other side. When you start participating in a dollar auction, it looks like a great deal from your own perspective. You think, well, gosh, I could bid $12 and I might win $20. That looks like a good deal. But then think you're in a class with 40 other people who are thinking the same way. And you realize how easily you can be trapped and how this can easily escalate if everyone is thinking the same way and not thinking about the perspective of the other side. So what the research shows is that what separates a good negotiator from a great negotiator is this ability to look at the deal from the other side. I had dinner a couple of years ago with one of the most successful graduates of my business school. He was the chief finance officer of IBM. He was in the Apple board of directors. He was involved in many complex financial deals. And over the course of the dinner, I asked him, I said, Jerry, you've been involved in a number of very complex negotiations. You've probably seen some of the best negotiators in the world. What is it that separates these negotiators from others? And he didn't hesitate a second. He said, it's the ability to look at the deal from the other side. Another friend who was on the Michigan Business School faculty was a senior advisor to President Clinton. He left our faculty for a while to serve in this position. And over lunch, he told me about President Clinton's negotiating style. He said that when President Clinton was visiting the prime minister of another country, my friend would have a half hour, very strict time limits, to brief the president on the issues relating to the other country. And so he told me in that half hour, he was told to give the president 4 main points, 4 main issues between the two countries. And then after that, he was asked, how do these issues relate to the concerns of the other country? And he said that it was amazing how quickly President Clinton grasped the initial 4 issues and understood the issues from the perspective of the other side, and then was able to reframe the U.S. issues so that they met the concerns of the, let's say, the prime minister of the other country. Let me test your ability to look at issues from the perspective of the other side with this story. We've got another president running for office by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. And it's in the final stages of a campaign. And Teddy Roosevelt has, let's say, 3 million pamphlets printed with a picture of him looking very presidential on the pamphlet. And he intends to take a train tour across America, give speeches, and distribute these pamphlets. Just before the tour begins, after the pamphlets are printed, he learns that a photography studio holds the copyright to these pictures, to the picture on the pamphlets. And the problem is, he has no money left in his campaign to pay for copyright permission. Copyright permission could run, let's say, $1 a pamphlet. That would be $3 million, and he has no money left. He doesn't want to use the pamphlets illegally. That could kill his campaign. But he needs these pamphlets to win the election. So he had a huge dilemma, didn't know what to do. So finally he called a friend on Wall Street who was a famous negotiator. And he asked, "What should I do? Help me." Now, if he had called you under these circumstances, what would you do? Again, you need these 3 million pamphlets to win the election. You don't want to use the picture illegally in violation of copyright, and you don't have any money to pay for copyright permission. And when I ask this question in class, students come up with some pretty good possibilities. Well, why not make this person the official White House photographer if you win the election? Or why not give the photographer the chance for publicity, the publicity that you're using his picture on the pamphlets? And those are very good suggestions. But this is what the famous negotiator did. He sent a cable to the photography studio that said, "We're planning to distribute millions of pamphlets with Roosevelt's picture on the cover. It will be great publicity for the studio whose photograph we use. How much will you pay us to use your photo? Respond immediately." And the photography studio responded, I forget the exact amount, I think it was around $250. They said, "We'll pay you $250 to use the photo." So there's a great negotiator, somebody who was able to look at the situation from the perspective of the other side, and instead of paying them, it ended up the studio paying Roosevelt. Let's try one other example, and this is a bit of a mind bender. I'll warn you in advance. I hope you're awake wherever you are in the world, because this is a challenging scenario. So here's the deal. You work on an acquisitions team for a company, and you're considering making an offer to buy another company. The value of the target company is uncertain because they're involved in oil exploration. They're not sure of the results. The value could be anywhere from $0 to $100 million. And all of those values are equally likely. In other words, it's equally likely that the value is 47 million as it is 97 million. You do know that you have very good management in your company, and that under your management, the target company will be worth 50% higher than its current value, whatever that value is. Now, the target company knows exactly what it's worth because it knows the results of the oil exploration. How much would you bid? You can only make one offer, take it or leave it. So take as long as you want with this. Before I move on to the next slide, you might even hit pause. But think, how much would you bid? And the correct answer is that you should bid nothing, because all the offers that you might make have a negative value. Let's take an example. Let's say that you bid $60 million. Now, the target company knows exactly what it's worth. So if it's worth more than 60, the target company is not going to accept your offer. It's only going to accept offers that range from 0 to 60. What's the average value of those offers? 30 million on average, because each value is equally likely. And you know that under your management, the company is going to be worth 50% more than the bid. So on average, your bid is worth 30 million. You add 50%, that brings it up to 45 million, which means that you have lost $15 million on your $60 million bid. Now, I promised that would be complicated, but there's a very simple underlying principle involved here, and that is always look at the deal from the perspective of the other side. If you had looked at it from the perspective of the target company, then these results should be clear. And that concludes our look at escalation. Let's now move on to another tool or a trap related to psychology, and that's the concept of reciprocation, or also called reciprocity. And basically what this means is that when somebody does something for us, we as human beings feel the need to repay what they've given us. According to anthropologist Richard Leakey, this is what really makes us human and separates us from other forms of animal life. When we first began to share food, to share tools, and to reciprocate with each other. Now, reciprocity is a tool that's especially useful in negotiation. And let me give you a personal example of reciprocity in a negotiation I was involved in India a few years ago. One of my former students invited me to participate in his wedding in Mumbai. So I flew out for the wedding and had a wonderful time participating in the wedding, but then had a couple of extra days to explore the city following the wedding. So one afternoon, I visited a beautiful area in Mumbai called the Hanging Gardens, a wonderful park. And as I approached the Hanging Gardens, a young girl who looked like she was probably 7 or 8 years old and perhaps lived on the street walked up to me and offered to sell me a fan made out of peacock feathers. I said, absolutely not interested. So I then started to walk into the park, and as I walked into the park, she followed me, and as she followed me, she described various features of the park. She described the vegetation, the topiary, some buildings, the history of the park. In effect, she gave me a wonderful guided tour. Guess what I walked out of the park holding? A peacock fan. She may have been young, she may have lived on the street, but she was very smart, and she understood that if she did something good for me, I would feel the need to reciprocate. This is something that's very useful in negotiation where there are many issues involved, and where, for example, there's an issue that's important to the other side that maybe is less important to you. When you give in on that issue, then often they will feel the need to reciprocate and give in on another issue that's more important to you. So in trading off issues, reciprocity plays an important role. Let's now move on to the next tool or trap, which is called the contrast principle, which basically means that things look different when presented in sequence than when they do when presented in isolation. And let me give you another personal example of the contrast principle. When I bought my first house, I asked a real estate agent to show me some properties. So she first took me to a house that was probably the ugliest house I've ever seen. It was very run down, needed a lot of work, and it had a huge price. And I said, absolutely not interested. Then she took me to a second property that was an attractive house, but still very run down, needed a lot of work, and had a huge price. Said, not interested. Then she took me to a third property. This one was very attractive, very well maintained, and had a huge price. I said, I'll take it. Now, what had she done? Well, she used the contrast principle. She realized that that third house was going to look a lot different after I looked at the other two. It was going to look a lot different in contrast to the other two. In fact, realtors often call these properties, the first two properties, setup properties. They're setting me up for the third property, which looks different in contrast. Had she taken me to the third property first, I probably would have said, absolutely not interested, the price is way too high. But in contrast to the other two, it looked like a good deal. Let me read you a letter that has been on the internet for a number of years. It's a very touching story. It's a letter from a college student to her parents. And this is the way the letter reads. Dear Mom and Dad, it has been 3 months since I left for college. I'm very sorry for my thoughtlessness in not having written before. I will bring you up to date now, but before you read on, you better sit down, okay? I'm getting along pretty well now. The skull fracture and the concussion I got when I jumped out of my apartment window when it caught fire shortly after my arrival is pretty well healed now. I only spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and now I can see almost normally and only get those sick headaches once a day. Luckily, the fire in my apartment and my jump were witnessed by Roger, an attendant at a gas station, and he was the one who called the fire department. He also visited me in the hospital, and since I had nowhere to live, he was kind enough to invite me to share his apartment with him. He's a very fine man, and we are planning to get married. We haven't set the date yet, but it will be before my pregnancy begins to show. His divorce is final now, and he shares custody of his 3 children. The reason for the delay in our marriage is that Roger has a minor infection which prevents us from passing our premarital blood tests, and I carelessly caught the infection from him. This will soon clear up with the penicillin injections I am taking daily. Now that I've brought you up to date, I want to tell you that there was no fire in my apartment. I did not have a concussion or skull fracture. I was not in the hospital. I am not pregnant. I am not engaged. I do not have syphilis, and there is no divorced man in my life. However, I am getting a D in my art class and an F in biology, and I wanted you to see those grades in their proper perspective. Your loving daughter, Jane. Well, Jane might be having trouble with biology, but she certainly understands the contrast principle, and I'm sure she's going to do very well in her psychology classes. Okay, one last tool or trap, and that is looking at the big picture perspective. Very important in any negotiation not to get lost in the details. What I'd like you to do now is to hit pause and go to this website and watch this YouTube video. What you're going to see is a scene something like this. You're going to see 2 basketball teams, one team wearing white shirts and the other team wearing black shirts. Each team has a basketball, and they're passing the ball to their other team members. What I'd like you to do is to count the number of passes made by the team members wearing white shirts. This takes a lot of concentration to try to get an accurate count. This only takes, I'm not sure, maybe 15 seconds. So please stop, go to this website, watch the video, and see if you can answer the question correctly. How many passes made by the team members wearing white shirts? And what you'll find out when you finish is an illustration of the importance of not getting lost in the details and taking a look at the big picture. This was very well put recently by a lawyer. She's actually a Canadian lawyer working for the International Air Transport Association. When you negotiate, you need to always keep in mind the big picture of what your client wants to achieve, and always come back to it to avoid the trap of being lost in the details. Well, this concludes our look at a number of psychological tools and traps. And as I suggested at the beginning, I recommend that you keep this checklist close at hand. Like Charlie Munger, who advises Warren Buffett, you might want to stuff it into your pocket, and whenever you're faced with a question, a dilemma, a challenge during negotiation, or maybe even when making financial decisions or leadership decisions, pull it out of your pocket to test your judgment. This concludes our look at the unit on negotiation.